This presentation is intended for those who already have a good grasp of the details of the events in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963. In particular, the shots to the throat and the head. The late Sherry Feaster concluded that the fatal headshot had to have come from an area to the south of the triple underpass, and not the grassy knoll to the north. Here we will examine the throat and head shots, to determine where they originated, using Sherry's methodology. It is important to understand the exact nature of the wounds. Some were observed at Parkland, all were observed at the Bethesda autopsy, however not all were documented. The small wound on the right side of the head, in the temporal area, was observed at the autopsy by Navy Corpsman James Jenkins. It is not described in the autopsy report. New Zealander Ant Davison made this rendition of the Zapruder film. Here we see only the frames taken at the moment JFK was hit in the throat. Because of the technique Davison uses, this is perhaps the most important breakthrough in the study of the actual shooting sequence, since it was originally filmed. In a press conference shortly after JFK's death was announced, the doctors at Parkland were unequivocal. There was an entrance wound in the neck. This should never have been a matter of debate. The first-day evidence is always the most important. Those who forced the doctors to backtrack later had an agenda. These diagrams illustrate what Dr. Perry was describing. The wound itself was in the midline. There is injury to the anatomical right lateral aspect of the trachea, at the level of the external wound. The trachea itself was deviated to the left. Dr. Baxter explained that the external wound was very small. The missile passed between the trachea on the right side, and the strap muscles situated adjacent to it. This is a wound of entry. Logically it cannot be anything else. The single wound in the back, documented in the autopsy report, and observed by James Jenkins, was tracked, and had no point of exit into the pleural cavity. The external wound was in the lower anterior third, in the midline. The missile had gone to the right of the trachea, at the level of the external wound. In plain English, this means that the wound trajectory was, anatomically, left to right. This left-to-right trajectory means the bullet came from left of profile. It is important to understand that unless the president's whole body was turned to the right, not just his head, this also means the bullet came from the front left of the vehicle. A head turn does not affect this trajectory. Try it for yourself. As was explained earlier, the exact nature of all four wounds lead to logical conclusions. James Jenkins said the back wound did not enter the pleural cavity, though its impression could be seen when the organs were removed. As the rear wound only partially penetrated the body, then logically, it didn't exit. By extension, this means that the back wound was not an exit point for the throat shot, and vice versa. Neither the wound to the torso, nor the wound to the neck exited the body. In the Davison Zapruder film we see the president appearing to gag, and instinctively reach for his throat. We know the bullet has entered from the left front, so the next obvious question is what path did it take? This excerpt from the UK documentary The Men Who Killed Kennedy provides the answer.
If one examines the White House garage logs, it is very interesting that in the late evening of November 24th, 1963, and the entire day of November 25th, 1963, not one person is listed as having come in to the White House garage to have any contact with the limousine.
The late George Whitaker Sr., seen here with his wife, was a lifetime employee with Ford and held a managerial position at the Rouge plant. He went to work on the morning of November 25th to be confronted by an amazing sight.
He was astonished when he went to the B building where garage existed at that time, and he saw the Kennedy limousine that John F. Kennedy had been murdered in. The interior of the limousine had completely been stripped, and the windshield was not in the limousine. He went to the glass lab where he was in charge of laminating glass, and the glass lab door was locked. He knocked on the door, and it was open, and two of his subordinates were in there with the windshield that had been removed from the vehicle. They were under orders to take that windshield and use it as a template in making a new windshield. But what fascinated him, and which he discussed with his family and no one else until he spoke with me, was that he saw a hole in the windshield.
It was a good, clean bullet hole right straight through in the front. Right. This had a clean, round hole in the front and fragmentized from front to back.
Mr. Whitaker had 30 years of experience working with glass and had seen many tests performed on glass, including tests performed with firearms. He described that hole as being in the same location that Charles Taylor Jr. of the Secret Service had described the hole in his report. And of course, without knowing that anybody had observed it before then. But he also was absolutely 100% convinced that that shot had to emanate from the front of the Kennedy limousine, thus indicating that a shot had been fired from the front, to his mind, to 100% certainty.
After George Whitaker died in 2001, this statement was found amongst his possessions, reaffirming for future generations exactly what he had told Doug Weldon 8 years previously.
This document was discovered, and for me, it gave the final stamp of approval that what he told me on that August day in 1993 was in fact the truth of what really happened.
Further corroboration of a shot fired from in front of Kennedy's car came from the late Dr. Evalia Glanges in her only filmed interview. She was no stranger to guns.
I've been handling a gun since I was a child. Couldn't even hold the gun. I had to put it on the fence in order to shoot it. Paul! On the morning of November the 22nd, 1963, I was a second-year medical student at Southwestern Medical University in Dallas, Texas. We ran around the side of the building to the emergency room exit, and the presidential limousine was there. Had been staying there for some time, just watching the back of the emergency room, when I realized that there was a bullet hole in the windshield. Talked to my friend next to me and said, "Look, there's a bullet hole in the windshield," and pointed it out to them. At the time, I did not know any of the details of the shooting. I was quite shocked when I looked up and saw the bullet hole, but it was very clear. It was a through and through bullet hole through the windshield of the car from the front to the back. I don't believe there's even any cracks associated with that bullet hole. It seemed like a high-velocity bullet that had penetrated from front to back in that glass pane. At which point, a security officer of some type raced forward and jumped in the limousine and drove it off, even as I was leaning against it, to an area back of us somewhere. And that was the last time I saw the limousine.
The Secret Service made certain no authority in Dallas had an opportunity to examine the bullet damage to Kennedy's car.
This is the letter, written by George Whitaker Sr., and found by his family after his death. He states, quote, "It had a bullet hole in it. The hole was about 4 to 6 inches to the right of the rear view mirror. The shot had come from the front." End quote. This photograph, known as Alchin 6, was taken approximately 1.5 seconds after the president was hit in the throat. It clearly shows a bullet hole. It made it to press, and was shown to camera on TV, within hours. This photo therefore corroborates what George Whitaker Sr. and Dr. Evalia Glanges described seeing in the excerpt from The Men Who Killed Kennedy, because it shows the bullet hole. The Warren Commission acknowledged the crack in the windshield. They produced a windshield as evidence of it being struck from the rear. That windshield resides in the National Archives. If George Whitaker Sr. was telling the truth, then the Warren Commission is telling a lie. The fact that this photograph made it to press and TV so early after the assassination is the reason for that lie. Seconds later, AP photographer Ike Alchins took this photo, known as Alchin 7. In the inserted blow-up, as it was in the previous slide, the hole is tinted to highlight it. It is important to understand that, in his previous photograph, the sun was behind Alchins. It is now above him and to the left when he takes this image. The hole, The windshield and limousine are now at a different angle in relation to the lens. Different angle, different aspect, and different lighting means that the whole appears different. It does not mean, as some argue, that both pictures show two different reflections. To illustrate what we see in Alchin 6 and 7, a scale model of the presidential limousine is used. A commercial product in the UK called blue tack, a kind of putty, is used to mark the position of the bullet hole on the model's windshield. The rear view mirror is circled blue, the bullet hole is circled red. The frontal image replicates Alchin 6, the rear view replicates Alchin 7. Together, these photographs demonstrate how differing perspectives alter the apparent distance between the hole and the rear view mirror. In simple terms, this proves both Alchin's photos show the same thing. The thing described by two witnesses as a bullet hole. Taking a close look at Zapruder frame 215, we see a small glint of light, in exactly the same place on the windshield that the hole is visible in Alchin 6 and 7. It is also exactly where George Whitaker Sr. described it, in the note discovered by his family, after his death. Using simple software, it is possible to superimpose the position of the sun in Dealey Plaza at 12:30 on 22nd of November 1963. The green line represents the horizontal plane of the windshield. The green dot, the object seen in Zapruder frame 215. They are positioned on Elm Street at approximately the spot Zapruder frame 215 was taken. Note that the sun is directly above the terminal annex building parking lot. If you imagine a single beam of light from that direction, it would reflect from the horizontal plane, the windshield, at an angle equal to that at which it struck it. The angle of reflection is equal to the angle of incidence. It is therefore no coincidence that our single beam of light reflects to exactly where Zapruder stood. The red line is perpendicular to the windshield. The angle between the red line and the incoming beam of light is equal to the angle between the red line and the light reflected off the windshield. This is 25 frames later, at a film speed of just over 18 frames per second, that is almost 1.5 seconds. The glint on the windshield has faded significantly. The fact that we no longer see a reflection is actually proof that we did see something, quite small, being reflected 25 frames earlier. That's because the vehicle has traveled along Elm Street. In this diagram, the plane of the windshield has rotated anti-clockwise, as the limousine negotiated the gentle curve to the south. In 1.5 seconds the sun has not moved in the sky. The windshield, however, has changed its position relative to the sun. Now, our single beam of light still reflects from the windshield, at an angle equal to that at which it struck it, but Zapruder is no longer along its trajectory. This is a greatly simplified example, but illustrates the process involved. Almost 1 second after the reflection becomes invisible to Zapruder, Alchin 6 is taken. Using the flag, Kellerman, Connolly and Jackie's glove, we can estimate that frame 255 shows, from Zapruder's perspective, the moment Alchin took his photo. From that we can therefore deduce that the photo was taken approximately 2 seconds after JFK has been hit. Once again, Alchin 6, showing the bullet hole, and in the insert, tinted, to make it easier to see. An object causes a reflection to Zapruder's lens, but only for a few frames, before it ceases to be visible. It is now visible to Alchin's, in both photos he took on that spot. The object is in exactly the same place as the bullet hole seen by Charles Whitaker Sr., which he described as frontal in origin, and 4 to 6 inches to the right of the rear view mirror. A frontal bullet hole is also seen and clearly described by Dr. Avelia Glanges, a medical student at Parkland Hospital. It is therefore not conjecture, but a logical deduction, that there is a frontal bullet hole in the windshield, and that we have clear photographic and filmic evidence of it. If a bullet pierces an inclined windshield, it is a proven scientific fact that the bullet's onward trajectory is directly affected by which face of the windshield it strikes. All windshields slope, top to bottom, away from the driver. A frontal hit will deflect downward. This is a direct result of the physical forces experienced as the bullet meets the windshield. This results in a turning motion that causes the bullet to rotate and imparts a slightly downward deviation from its original trajectory. The opposite is true if the bullet strikes the rear first. It would be deflected upwards. To summarize, therefore, There is a front impacting bullet hole in the windshield, left of profile from JFK's perspective. The bullet responsible for the hole is deflected downward, due to the slope of the windshield. The bullet has a tendency to strip as it passes through the glass, its velocity is reduced. The mass of the bullet is now distributed amongst the fragmentary remains of the once whole projectile. The largest of those fragments will be the bullet's core. This means there is now a smaller, lighter, slower projectile, traveling onward towards its target, striking the target at a point lower than it would if it had not struck the windshield. This is consistent with the throat wound, which was anatomically left to right, and, although the bullet was fired from a high-powered rifle, it did not pass through the neck tissues and exit at the rear, despite its relatively low density. This photograph was taken from the corner of Elm and Houston, adjacent to 501 Elm Street, which in 1963 was the Daltex building. It clearly illustrates the downward slope of Elm, towards the triple underpass. Note that the upper surface of the underpass itself, as well as land either side of it, are not at the same elevation as the photographer. They are a few feet lower. The Davison rendition of the Zapruder film allows us to visualize the slope of Elm Street much more easily than the original, unrendered footage. Note that the president does not appear to be in any distress until he emerges from behind the Stemmons freeway sign. In fact, his movement and position is such that it appears most likely he was struck almost immediately before we see him. This is Zapruder frame 215. It is the first frame where JFK is completely obscured by the Stemmons freeway sign. We have already seen that he exhibited no visible signs of being hit before this frame. Frame 215 is also the first frame in which the reflection in the location of the windshield bullet hole seen and described by witnesses is visible in the film. Logically, therefore, whichever frame actually recorded the moment the bullet struck, this is the only one we can use as reference. As we shall see later, the difference of a few frames has little to no bearing on any conclusions we can draw from data taken using frame 215 as a reference point. Because Zapruder shot his film from a very specific and well-documented spot, a small abutment on the north side of Elm Street, it is very easy to take images which approximately replicate those he took that day. Whilst the exact focal specifications would be necessary to make a scientifically accurate replica image of frame 215, for the purposes of this exercise in data collection, any differences, again, have no meaningful effect on the resulting conclusions we can draw. We now have an almost identical canvas on which to superimpose our Zapruder frame 215. This is the result. The frame was placed by reducing its opacity and adjusting the scale and angle, keeping the proportions constant. A degree of transparency in the Zapruder frame allows us to see the limousine in place on the Elm Street of today. By using lines of perspective, the position of JFK can be approximated by reference to key points in and around the limousine. Here, the Elm curb and the two flags at the front of the vehicle give longitudinal and latitudinal references. The vertical green line gives us the spot on Elm needed for the next stage of the process. The point established by the superimposed frame was marked on the layer that comprised entirely of the modern-day image. Removing frame 215 leaves the position of JFK on Elm at the moment captured by that frame. Using an accurate mapping tool, we can determine the exact coordinates of that spot, and, most importantly, its elevation, which is given as 421.9 feet above sea level. In the vehicle, we have three critical data points. This analysis uses the wounds as its starting point. The throat wound is data point 1. The yellow line is profile, longitudinal axis of the vehicle, direction of travel, and constitutes our second data point. Finally, we have the windshield bullet hole. The red line plotted from JFK data point 1 through the bullet hole, data point 3, compared with profile, data point 2, gives an angle of approximately 15 degrees. Whilst precise data would obviously be the ideal, approximate data still gives us an acceptable margin. The data can now be put to work. JFK data point 1 now becomes the point on Elm where he was struck, if we assume it to be Zapruder frame 215. Using data point 2, direction of travel, we can then project data point 3, the incoming bullet, by rotating 15 degrees. Again, whilst the direction the vehicle moved cannot be known precisely, it can be estimated with reasonable accuracy. In this instance, the white lane markings were used as reference. Having determined where on Elm Street the bullet struck JFK in the throat, a camera on a tripod is placed on that spot. The spot is our designated data point 1, and is aligned along data point 2, direction of travel. A determination of direction of travel is aided by the white lane markers. In the resulting photograph, the yellow arrow is vertically aligned at the dead center of the image. Using degree markings on the tripod, the camera was rotated 15 degrees to the left, and this photograph was taken. The red arrow represents the relative direction of the bullet hole, data point 3, to the wound, data point 1, the camera itself. The arrow is vertically along the dead center of the photograph. By extension, therefore, it indicates the location of the shot's origin. We now have the approximate position of the gunman. Using the same software employed to establish the position of the throat bullet strike, we can approximate the position of the gunman, using the different trees visible in both this and the previous image. The coordinates are not as important as the elevation, which is 421.9 feet. This is exactly the same elevation as the place on Elm Street which we established earlier as being where JFK was struck in the throat, Zapruder frame 215. It should be noted that Christian David was quoted in The Men Who Killed Kennedy, as saying that alleged assassin Lucien Sardi told him that the shot was plus horizontal, more horizontal. From our estimated gunman location, we now project his field of fire. This includes both throat and head shots, and, as you can see, is comparatively narrow. The vehicle would have been tracking toward the gunman, left to right, whilst also getting closer between the two shots. Remember, the throat shot was the intended kill shot. The gunman's chosen position allowed for a second chance, and would have been one of the factors for choosing the location. The field of fire, viewed from the opposite direction, shows how relatively easy the vehicle would have been for a professional assassin to track. This brings us to the next phase of evidence gathering. Sherry Feaster's work Enemy of the Truth forensically examined the headshot and determined the most likely origin as being in the same vicinity as the throat shot that this investigation has identified. If both shots were fired by the same person, the data for the headshot will confirm this. To test this, we must therefore begin, as before, with the wounds. Sherry used a trajectory cone based upon the parameters of the wounds, and adopted the right temple as the point of entry. Later, James Jenkins published a memoir stating exactly where on JFK's skull the wound actually was. Navy Corpsman Jenkins, who participated in the autopsy, saw a small wound on the right side of the head, in the temporal area, just forward of the right ear. The rear exit wound is described by the closest witness, post-trauma, to testify to it publicly, the late Dr. Robert McClelland. He, along with around 20 others, saw a wound in the right rear of the skull, most often referenced as the occipital parietal area. The importance of these two statements will become apparent as we progress. The late Dennis David was shown autopsy film and photos by his friend, Lieutenant Commander William Bruce Pitzer. David is pointing to the same spot described by Jenkins, the right temple. Perhaps the single most important statement concerning the president's head wound was made by Acting Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff, who had to break the news of JFK's death to the world, in a press conference at Parkland Hospital, shortly after it was confirmed. This statement, made very shortly after the president was pronounced dead, should remove any and all controversy over the head wound. Kilduff is relaying that the president's personal physician, Dr. George Berkeley, present at the moment JFK was pronounced dead, saw a bullet wound in the right temple. Kilduff also points to the exact spot described by Jenkins, David, and, obviously, Berkeley himself. It is only because of an illusion that the myth of a successful shot to the head from the grassy knoll has been perpetuated. Note those carefully chosen words. It is not in question that shots were fired from somewhere in the vicinity of the stockade fence. The facts, however, prove that those shots missed, as we shall soon see. Furthermore, they may never actually have been intended to hit. We have already seen that the throat wound is consistent in all aspects, both directional and degree of damage, with a shot from the south knoll. What we will see now is why people still think a successful headshot from the stockade fence area, the grassy knoll, is possible. You are about to experience the Zapruder illusion. Using the same software as previously, we can establish the coordinates of the position of JFK as captured in Zapruder frame 313, the headshot. Note the elevation is 417.5 feet. That is a little over 4 feet lower than the South Knoll Gunman location, established by the throat shot analysis. Using Zapruder frame 312, which was captured approximately 1/18 of a second prior to the headshot, we see a vehicle, traveling left to right, which is east to west. We know the vehicle is headed toward an underpass which runs north-south, perpendicular to 3 converging roads, one of which is seen here. We know, therefore, that the underpass is to the right, out of view. Because of this, the mind's eye is fooled into believing that the car is therefore perpendicular to the underpass. This illusion is only possible because there are no other points of reference save the curb and grass verge. It is also exaggerated because the road arcs around Zapruder, meaning that as he pans left to right, we don't notice the curve. We therefore imagine the road to be straight, and thus perpendicular to the underpass. Here is unedited Zapruder footage of the headshot. The camera is zoomed in on the car and the occupants. We have only bystanders as reference points, which prevents us visualizing the larger picture. What is so groundbreaking about Aunt Davison's rendition of the film is how it provides a larger perspective. This is done by cleverly keeping each and every frame and stitching them together as overlapping layers, leaving other elements in their true position. In effect, the redundant, or yet-to-be-reached frames, allow the whole area to remain visible throughout the clip. The only thing unreal about the extras in this scene is that they are shown at the time they were actually captured on film, and remain lifeless both before and after. It was this footage that made the illusion of the original film apparent, and ultimately led to this investigation. This combination of photos illustrates how different the scene looks once you place Zapruder frame 212 within a current-day photo, taken from exactly the same point, looking in exactly the same direction. The illusion is best explained by saying that, in the close-up Zapruder frame, your mind imagines the car's trajectory as being that of Main Street, which is the central of the 3 lanes visible in the image on the right. The red line is the line of sight along which you are actually looking in the picture on the left. The difference between real and perceived direction of travel is 45 degrees. The 2 cones converging on the red arrow represent the trajectory cones of gunmen behind the stockade fence to the right, and the one to the left. There is strong evidence there was a gunman at either of these locations, if not both. The red arrow represents the vehicle's direction of travel, the yellow line the path of the bullet from the South Knoll, left to right. There is no possible way that the wounds reported by witnesses at Parkland or Bethesda support a shot from the illustrated trajectory cone, being responsible for them. Just because an assassination took place, it doesn't mean that every shot, by every shooter, was aiming to kill. The books The Inheritance by Christopher Fulford, and There's a Fish in the Courthouse by Gary Ween, document a false flag attack taking place on November 22. The intent was to blame Cuba to force an invasion by Kennedy. The evidence in the books comes from Sheriff Bill Decker and Secret Service agent Robert Buch. Buch verified that Decker was a CIA asset. That subplot did not involve the death of Kennedy. And the plethora of missed shots substantiate that it was indeed a false flag attack. By all logical parameters, the grassy knoll is not a suitable location for a covert assassination attempt. The so-called kill zone, facilitated by triangulation of gunfire, makes no sense if the perpetrators are so inept that they miss the occupants, and even the limousine itself. It makes perfect sense if it's for effect, to put on a show. This is exactly what Chauncey Holt was told to expect. A demonstration, a commotion. The grassy knoll gunmen, or gunmen, were a distraction, a means of attracting attention. An assassin does not attract attention. Our assassin, on the South Knoll, avoided all detection. Until now. This Sherry Feaster graphic was very influential in the way this analysis is presented. The style used encapsulates perfectly the need for a striking way to convey information that is relatively complicated to put into words. The skull is centered on the position of the limousine at Zapruder frame 313. If it were to scale, it would be impossible to distinguish. That it is so large is immaterial to the data it represents, as the black line, JFK's line of sight, passes through what is widely termed the Grodin X, and is centered in the skull image. The yellow cone is Zapruder's camera field of view. The image of JFK and Jackie is what we see in an image taken within that field. Both blue lines are parallel in this image. They are a graphic indication showing that JFK was facing the direction the blue line traces. This graphic powerfully demonstrates the deception of the Zapruder camera angle. Not until you appreciate what you are really seeing at the moment of headshot, can you then understand what information the image provides, allowing proper forensic interpretation of the headshot. This graphic is the clearest indication that a shot from the stockade fence could not be responsible for the head wounds, nor the physical reaction of JFK that results from impact. The movie JFK instilled into the public consciousness the notion that he was thrown back and to the left. He was, but a more accurate description would be back and then to his left. The shot transfers momentum, at the same time that it disabled motor functions. The result is that the body moves with the force. The force is actually coming from the direction his body was turned and facing. The momentum is transferred from the bullet, in the same direction the bullet was traveling. Therefore, back is relative to bullet origin. If you watch Zapruder carefully, the move to the left is actually a separate motion, following the move backwards. It is the body, having been released by Jackie, falling under its own weight in the direction it was leaning. To the left. If the shot were from the direction of the stockade fence, depicted here by the yellow line, then back, the transfer of momentum, and left, would be one and the same. And, most crucially, the wounds would not be those described by the witnesses. As Sherry stipulated, the wound is the starting point of any forensic analysis. The point at issue is not whether there was a shot from the grassy knoll, it is whether such a shot struck the president in the head. The forensic evidence proves that the grassy knoll was not the origin of the headshot. It was part of the elaborate false flag attack, a separate event entirely from the assassination. This investigation began with the throat shot, because the data available for that particular shot allowed for the calculation of a point of origin, to a relatively high degree of certainty. Sherry's work had narrowed down the likely origin of the headshot as being within a trajectory cone spanning from the underpass to a substantial portion of the South Knoll. We have established a more specific area on the South Knoll as the origin of the throat shot. It is reasonable to assume that the throat shot was an intended kill shot. It is therefore a logical progression to presume that the gunman in that area, having missed, would be the same person that went on to fire the fatal headshot. To put it another way, the false flag attack was not an assassination attempt, but the throat shot was. One man was in the plaza to kill JFK, and therefore, one man must have fired those two shots. Proof of this would come with a thorough examination of the headshot trajectory. The same methods will be used here to determine the origin of the headshot. Researcher Robert Grodin is responsible for painting the X on Elm Street. He does it regularly to ensure its significance is not forgotten. It is widely regarded as an accurate depiction of the spot JFK was struck and killed by the headshot. As with the throat shot calculation, pinpoint accuracy would be desirable, but minor inaccuracies do not materially affect the research objective. That objective is to confirm or deny that the successful assassin was not, as widely believed, on the grassy knoll, but was instead situated, on the South Knoll, directly opposite. To verify Grodin's placement of the X, we have already seen that the unaltered Zapruder film alone is of little use because of its lack of reference points. But if we look at the exact same moment in time, as captured by Orville Nix and another of Ant Davison's excellent renditions, we can now, with reference points, confirm the place on Elm Street where the X should be. Charles Bronson managed to capture the moment of headshot also, in the briefest of clips, thus allowing further verification of Grodin's placement of the X. Those believing the Zapruder film to be altered must realize that, for the headshot at least, the corroborating footage of these two films, as well as that taken by Marie Muchmore, show a sequence consistent with Zapruder. As with the throat shot, we once again have three critical data points. This time JFK's head is data point 1. The yellow line represents the profile, longitudinal axis of the vehicle, and direction of travel, and once again constitutes our second data point. The red line plotted from JFK data point 1 is at a 25-degree angle, compared with profile, data point 2. This angle was calculated for the House Select Committee on the Assassinations of JFK and Martin Luther King. It is the direction JFK was facing in Zapruder frame 313. Any point along this line therefore becomes data point 3. Exactly as was done with the throat shot, data point 1 now becomes the point on Elm where JFK was struck, this time using the Grodin X as our marker. Using data point 2, direction of travel, we can then project data point 3 by rotating left 25 degrees. Again, whilst the direction the vehicle moved cannot be known precisely, it can be estimated with reasonable accuracy. The white lane markings were once again used as reference. The tripod-mounted camera is on the Grodin X, the spot designated data point 1, the point of headshot impact. It is aligned along data point 2, the direction of travel. The yellow arrow is vertically aligned at the dead center of the image taken from data point 1. Using degree markings on the tripod, the camera is rotated 25 degrees to the left. The red arrow represents JFK's line of sight, data point 3. This is where the observations of James Jenkins and Dennis David, as well as the statement by Malcolm Kilduff, concerning the entry wound in the right temple, become significant to the data gathering process. Taken along with the statements by Dr. McClelland and others, describing an avulsed occipital parietal exit wound, we can approximate the bullet path as being tangential. That means it entered and exited along the right side of the head. The bullet path is parallel with the center line of the skull. Logically, therefore, the gunman was somewhere along JFK's line of sight. He may not have been facing his assassin directly, but the deviation would have been minimal. Once again, the wounds point us directly to the gunman. We now return to the estimated location of the gunman firing the throat shot. The direction we have established that JFK was facing at the moment of headshot is this same area. It is important to understand that because the throat shot was first, and was accurately calculated, the site of its origin is fixed, and not recalculated from our headshot trajectory data. That data was necessary for comparison and confirmation. It is the direction JFK was facing, not the direction he was shot from. Though similar, because of the properties of the wound, they need not be identical. Again, the exact coordinates are not as important as the elevation. 421.9 feet. Because it is 4 feet higher than the road at the Grodin X, this means that the shot had a slight downward trajectory. We can now superimpose both the estimated origin of the throat shot and the spot JFK was directly facing. That they are not the exact same point, does not mean both shots were not fired by the same person. To begin with, due to road curvature, margin for error, and it not being possible to locate the head entrance and exit wound precisely, both of these two spots have sufficiently acceptable tolerance to be both one and the same. Even the fact that the shot passed through the outer right side of the skull adds a small, but unquantifiable degree of difference between the shot's point of origin and the direction the victim was facing. The famous Cancellaire photograph, taken approximately 20 seconds after the fatal headshot, is superimposed over a view of the South Knoll today. Almost identical in perspective, the black and white Cancellaire image required only angular adjustments to overlay the present-day image almost perfectly. Correct proportions were maintained. This allows us a view of the South Knoll today as it looked from the limousine in 1963. The foliage then was much less developed, affording little cover. Crucially, however, at 12:30 p.m. one is looking directly into the midday sun from this point. A distinct advantage to the sniper, it was obviously influential in their choice of location. On 22 November it is almost impossible to look in that direction at 12:30 on a cloudless day without shielding one's eyes. One only need look at the Alchin 6 photo to see several people on the book depository steps clearly shielding their eyes. Additional sniper protection is provided by the vehicles, all facing us in the 1963 photo, which would have added crouching cover and support to brace a rifle if necessary. The estimated origin of the throat shot becomes the focal point of the next phase of the investigation. The hypothesis assumes that the same gunman fired both the throat and head shot. It is therefore logical to position the viewer as close to that spot as possible. From this spot we will plot both trajectories from the gunman's perspective. The exact spot we have established using the camera and tripod would place the gunman behind a large tree. As we have estimated JFK to be facing slightly east of that point, left as we look here, it was decided to position our stand-in gunman to the left of the tree, so we could plot the view from that location to both throat and headshot target points. If our previous calculations were correct, the following data collected should verify them. Any variation from the pinpointed spot makes little to no difference to the outcome because of all the other variables involved. The estimated gunman position used for this analysis is circled in yellow. In all likelihood it would actually have been behind the fence. In 1963 it was a chain-link fence, and not so high as that of today. Tosh Plumlee flew in an abort team acting upon intelligence from cryptographer Eugene Dinkin and Lee Oswald. He said that the team's chain of command included the Pentagon and military intelligence, using CIA contract assets. He and his colleague Sergio were standing in the position indicated by the yellow circle. Tosh stated that during the assassination shot sequence, he heard a shot from behind and left of him. This photo is taken from the estimated gunman location, where the next stage of the analysis begins. It is to the left and behind Plumlee's location. We have determined the likely location of the gunman using logical deduction. That in itself should be sufficient, because the evidence can't point to more than one place. It is, however, necessary to establish whether the location we have identified works in practice. If it does, it basically confirms the gunman location as a certainty. Therefore it is necessary to photograph the throat hit and head hit locations, from our putative gunman location. Ideally that would be with a powerful zoom lens. Unfortunately, as you will soon learn, that ideal is not possible. Any passing vehicle has sufficient features for comparison with the limousine, and therefore those comparisons will either validate or invalidate this hypothesis. As you can see, the ideal photographic analysis is not possible from the location today, because of the overhanging tree canopy. To get around this problem, a spotter stayed at the gunman location and directed the placement of waypoints along the previously plotted trajectory. The spotter remained below the tree canopy, in order to have the clear view that was otherwise denied them. Focusing on a predetermined feature on Elm Street, beyond the target point, the spotter facilitated the plotting of the line of trajectory, by ensuring markers were placed accurately, and in a straight line. The markers were simply anything lying around that was big enough to see at a distance. At each placed waypoint, a photograph was taken. In the direction the bullet traveled. This photograph was taken from the South Commerce sidewalk, looking toward the throat hit location, and dead center is the chosen reference landmark on Elm. Dead center and trajectory are depicted by the yellow line. The process was repeated at intervals along the trajectory. This photograph was taken on Commerce itself, and the photographer's visual reference point is now more clearly visible. It was the left edge of the column, between the two furthest right, of 5 arched windows. As we get closer to the throat shot impact point, we are effectively traveling the bullet's path. As we do so, more detail of the target area becomes visible. The fourth photo reveals still more detail. It is worth noting that Ike Alchins, who would take his famous sixth photo from this vicinity just over 2 seconds after the throat shot, must have been within feet of the bullet, which would have passed to his right. The purpose of tracking the actual trajectory, i.e. reversing the process that estimated the origin, is encapsulated in this graphic. The timing of the photo was deliberate. It had to be as a vehicle passed the alignment point on the book depository. The choice of vehicle was also deliberate. It is larger than a car, more in scale with a limousine. The Alchin 6 windshield view is superimposed in the bottom right image. The 2-second timing difference obviously means the graphic cannot be a like-for-like reconstruction, but is used solely to illustrate the validity of the hypothesis, namely that a bullet from the estimated gunman location could strike the president's throat, having passed through the windshield, and avoided Greer, Kellerman, and Connolly. Throughout this investigation, it has been necessary to find solutions to problems. Forthcoming slides will use approximate measurements on the vehicle and its occupants. The schematic at the bottom of this composite shows various key dimensions of the limousine. It was produced for the Warren Commission. The upper photograph is of the limousine when new. The 60-inch measurement in the schematic is the width of the rear seat. If the photograph is scaled so that its length is equal to the diagram, a reasonable translation of dimensions on the schematic can be applied to it. Using photo software, our unit of measurement switches to pixels. A line depicting 60 inches is created, superimposed over the photograph, and matches the distance between a line parallel with the bottom of the tires and the top of the roof support bar. We now know that the top of the support bar is 60 inches above road level. Because we know the approximate height of the bullet hole, we draw the blue line from it to road level. We know its length in pixels, so it is a simple matter to convert it to inches. The result is that we now know that the bullet hole is approximately 50 inches above road level. This conversion process can then be applied to any image of the vehicle taken from ground level and used to measure any height above street level. That is because we have the fixed point of reference, the top of the roof support, and we know its height above street level. We also have a reasonable scale with which to measure other important reference points. In this image, the descent of Elm Street and the areas either side of it are depicted as lines of elevation. The closer together the lines, the steeper the decline; the further apart, the less steep the decline. The elevation and length calculations to this point can now be combined. The vehicle was 421.9 feet above sea level at our calculated throat impact point using Zapruder frame 215. The gunman was standing, kneeling, or even lying at a point no higher than 421.9 feet above sea level. If we assume, for the purposes of demonstration, that he was standing, then we must add the distance above ground of the rifle muzzle. Experimentation using an object such as a broom handle as our rifle gives us an approximate muzzle height of 4 feet from the ground when held and aimed. This means that, rounded up by 1 inch, the rifle muzzle elevation is 426 feet. In the inset photograph of the bullet hole, we see that it too is at 426 feet elevation. That's because the height above road level of 50 inches we calculated in the last slide, added to an elevation of 421.9 feet, and rounded down by 1 inch, gives us a bullet hole elevation of 426 feet. The shot was, for all intents and purposes, on the horizontal. Here, the red line represents bullet trajectory. Using maps, it is possible to calculate the distance from gun to throat as approximately 390 feet. The height difference between the two being either 0 or negligible means the angle of incidence of the incoming shot is 0. Horizontal. This replica limousine was filmed during one of its visits to Dallas. The yellow line is simply a graphic representation of the path taken by the bullet to the throat, within the vehicle. This time we see a much smaller replica, complete with model passengers. The limousine was photographed to match its trajectory and inclination at the moment of headshot, and the image superimposed on the location of the throat hit, as close to scale as the constraints of the limousine image's definition allowed. To the right is the same image, larger and more detailed, allowing the trajectory of the shot into the vehicle to be seen more clearly. Through a powerful scope in the hands of a professional assassin, it was an ambitious shot, yet one he obviously felt comfortable making. The throat shot representation is even more striking when viewed from JFK's perspective. Opponents of the idea that a shot was taken through the windshield at all must remember that the assassin himself had most likely rehearsed and taken bearings, based on the probability that the bubble top would have been on the limousine. In bubble top configuration, the limousine's weak spot from the sniper's perspective in this location was the car windshield. The gunman would have been in place and prepared to aim at a predetermined landmark, in exactly the same way that this investigation's reverse trajectory photos were taken. He will have steadied himself in good time for the limousine to enter his line of sight. Now the investigation must repeat the process of plotting a series of photographs to verify the trajectory of the headshot from the exact same spot on the South Knoll as was done for the throat shot. The same areas were used as waypoints, but along the new trajectory. This means that our first image is taken from the Commerce sidewalk. This photograph is taken from between Commerce and Main. Again, the yellow line is dead center and passes through a visual reference point on the book depository, which was not visible in the previous image. It is, as we look, the right edge of the 7th floor window, which is second from the left. Of course, the Groton X is also dead center. This photograph, taken from the grass median strip between Elm and Commerce, uses only the Groton X as the photographer's visual reference point. The throat shot was only 3 road markings to the right, showing how little the gunman had to adjust his aim in the 6 seconds between both shots. We now reach the most important phase of this investigation. In order to validate our calculated gunman's location, it remains necessary to ascertain from our findings whether the shot into the vehicle, with all of its occupants, and aimed at JFK's right temple, would actually be physically possible. It also needs to be proven that such a shot would match the known wounds. It is for that reason that the trajectory was meticulously tracked, first from the throat impact point back to origin, and then checked by plotting that shot from our calculated origin to the target. It is also why the direction JFK faced, and where that would coincide with the South Knoll, had to be tracked and verified in the same way. After confirming that it was physically possible for the throat shot to have worked from the calculated point of origin, if the same proves true of the headshot, then it is a logical certainty that the origin of both shots was indeed a single location on the South Knoll. In this image, the dark blue vehicle was captured at the moment it passed directly over the Groton X. Perfectly positioned, perfectly oriented, it is also an amazing coincidence that this vehicle, after several different attempts were made, happened to be the most accurately placed, because as we shall see, it is almost identical in color to the Kennedy limousine. Because the color matched so well, it allowed for some photo editing that wouldn't have worked nearly as well with a different colored vehicle. This is a larger scale replica of the limousine. It has been photographed from 25 degrees left of profile, at a slight downward angle, so as to represent as closely as possible the view the sniper would have of the limousine. The enlarged area circled is the sniper's perspective, a view through Greer's open side window. At this moment, captured in Zapruder frame 313, Greer is bent forward and looking over his right shoulder. That posture takes his head and body to our left as we look, which is sufficiently clear of this window opening. At exactly the same moment, Nellie has pulled John Connolly downward. He is facing the right profile of the vehicle, and is almost laying on his back, on her lap. Deceptive as it may appear, the portion of rear seat visible is actually the very left, anatomically, of the right-hand rear seat. At this moment JFK is leaning to his left, stooping very slightly forward, and his head is facing us, 25 degrees left of profile. Although only for illustration purposes, this graphic has superimposed the circular blow-up from the previous image, over the vehicle on Elm Street shown earlier. The key reference points to note in the image are the limousine's roof support, and chrome windshield frame, which closely aligns to that of the Elm vehicle. Those who won't accept that the fatal shot had to have come from the South Knoll, point to the height of the windshield as well as the upturned sun shields, as being the reason a frontal shot was not possible. This image shows that the path the bullet took avoided the windshield altogether. It also reinforces the point that the gunman on the grassy knoll could not have inflicted a front temporal entry, right occipital parietal exit wound on the president. It proves that a shot which matches the wound configuration was only possible from a vantage point on the South Knoll. The importance of this discovery is enormous. Remember, this view has been recreated using data from the throat shot. It meant calculating the origin of the throat shot, verification of that origin, and then verifying the path of the headshot from that same point. The result forensically demonstrates precisely how the shot was made, and denotes the South Knoll as the gunman's location, to the exclusion of all others. This simple graphic uses photo composition to powerfully illustrate how straightforward the headshot was for a professional gunman. What appears difficult to the naked eye is not nearly so difficult when magnified by a powerful scope, which the gunman most certainly would have used. The shot itself, however, was only possible because Greer slowed the limousine to allow the gunman the split-second opportunity to adjust his aim and fire. The circled image top left is Zapruder frame 212. Immediately beneath is the view from the opposite perspective, taken by Mary Moorman. As with the throat shot, the limousine image on Elm is then blown up to the right, and the two are identically aligned. Taken as a whole, this composite shows exactly how the gunman was able to hit JFK from his South Knoll location. It is very important that the viewer understands that this angle of ingress into the vehicle is the result of the calculations made to establish the location. It is not an estimate to explain a proposition but an explanation based upon data collected. Expert marksmen have argued that this location is too exposed for the gunman, that they themselves wouldn't choose this spot, and therefore it is unlikely to be the location of the gunman. The experts weren't the ones shooting, however, and their preferences are immaterial. The gunman's chosen location can only be determined by forensic methods. If the experts' chosen vantage points don't match the forensic evidence, then it proves that their expertise is simply opinion. Opinion is not evidence. Just as it did with the throat shot, this overhead perspective, looking toward the gunman, gives us a much clearer understanding of the trajectory, and of how narrow the margins were, for both gunman and victim. The full-size replica limousine shows the point even more dramatically. Although seemingly small when seen at a distance, up close, it's a big gap for a small bullet. A high-powered scope would have given the gunman all the space he needed, metaphorically speaking. Having examined the direction the bullet came from, we now look at why it was able to avoid John Connolly and why it couldn't have struck Jackie, as many people believe. Although intersecting at exactly the point of bullet impact, the yellow line does not represent the incoming bullet, but is a guide to aid measurement, in order to establish the height above the road that the bullet struck JFK. Note that the line is level with Jackie's left elbow. That is our reference point. Using the same method as we did to estimate the height, above street level, of the bullet hole in the windshield, we once again use the official schematic and photograph of the limousine as a means to calculate another metric. First, we note the height above street level of the roof support, approximately 60 inches. This is a frame from Aunt Davison's rendition of the Orville Nix film. It represents frame 312 of the Zapruder film from which we took the yellow line measurement, which we superimpose and the inset enlargement here. The frame has been rotated so that the incline of Elm Street is accurately represented. This was done by ensuring that the front steps of the pergola area are horizontal. Taking account of the incline, the red line of 60 inches to the top of the roof support gives us, on the same scale, a height of 50 inches for Jackie's right elbow, and therefore the point of bullet impact, invisible from this angle. Once again, this was achieved by counting the number of pixels represented by the 60-inch line, then measuring the number of pixels from the ground to Jackie's elbow and converting to inches. We use the same base graphic as for the throat shot, this time to illustrate the headshot. As before, the muzzle elevation above sea level, if the gunman is standing, is 426 feet. The elevation of the Groden X is 417.5 feet. We must add the 50 inches above road height that the bullet struck JFK as calculated earlier. This gives an elevation of approximately 422 feet for the bullet impact point. This means the muzzle is a maximum of 4 feet higher than the bullet impact point. The distance from the gunman to the Groden X is 305 feet. That means the angle of incidence, the declination from the greater height of 4 feet, is 0.75 degrees or 1.3%. The vehicle itself is at an opposing declination of 2, perhaps as much as 3 degrees. This means the shot came downward, relative to JFK's right temple, by between 3 and 4 degrees. As can be seen even in the blurred inset image, John Connolly's head is not as high as JFK's right temple, represented by Jackie's right elbow. That is the result of the opposing inclination of the vehicle and the incoming bullet. The downward trajectory meant the shot was therefore able to clear Connolly and strike JFK, and that is assuming he was between JFK and the gunman, something it is not possible to determine from any footage. As gruesome as it was nevertheless a remarkable shot. The red line shows how the downward incoming shot, combined with the opposite declination of the limousine, allowed the sniper to miss all but the intended target. The two inset frames to the left were taken at the same instant, from opposite perspectives. Opponents of this hypothesis argue that Jackie's head would have obstructed the gunman's view of JFK. They base their conclusion solely on the evidence of the Zapruder film. It is an unfortunate example, one of many, whereby those who believe the Zapruder film is altered, are nevertheless comfortable in citing it as evidence, when it suits their viewpoint. The opposing much more view shows a clear gap between Jackie's head and that of her husband. The diagram on the right visualizes this view from above. The line of sight and visible gap between the two heads from Zapruder's perspective is depicted by the red line. The line of sight and visible gap between the same two heads from Muchmore's perspective is depicted by the orange line. The only way the gap seen from Muchmore's perspective is possible is if Jackie's head was further back than it appears in the Zapruder image. Jackie's proximity to JFK is easy to calculate using the photographs from two opposing sides of the limousine. They clearly demonstrate that Jackie was not blocking the gunman's line of sight. Here is a close-up from Muchmore frame 42, shown as an insert within the full frame. It is proof that the Zapruder film was not substantially altered. Faintly visible is the backspatter from the bullet entry wound, described in great detail in Sherry Feaster's book Enemy of the Truth. It is visible only in this one frame because, as she explains, it is traveling at thousands of feet per second, and is dispersed as tiny droplets forming a very faint mist. Sherry Feaster concluded that the fatal headshot had to have come from an area she defined as a trajectory cone. The trajectory cone, derived from analysis of the entry and exit wounds, included the southern end of the underpass, and all of what has become known as the South Knoll. Using the boundaries of the entry and exit wounds, the arc that she projected forward was the only possible location the bullet could have come from. Sherry did not analyze the throat shot. That is because it occurred out of sight of Zapruder's camera, behind the Stemmons freeway sign. As a scientist, she would not attempt to verify anything without all of the necessary data. This analysis took the opposite approach. The Stemmons freeway sign gives us a very specific area on Elm Street where the shot occurred, in a very specific time frame. This analysis also worked from a very logic-driven assumption. The throat shot must have been an intended kill shot. Because it didn't kill JFK, the task remained to be completed. Therefore, the person who failed would have to try again. This means that if you can locate the origin of the throat shot, you will locate the origin of the head shot. This has been confirmed because this analysis has shown that the ballistics evidence from the headshot points to the same spot, with a small margin for error, as that for the throat shot. It is important to note that there is ample evidence that there were 3 operations taking place simultaneously in Dealey Plaza that afternoon. The first was a dummy assassination attempt, organized by E. Howard Hunt, and whose objective was to blame Castro and convince JFK to invade Cuba. That operation did not intend to kill the president, and is worthy of a video presentation of its own. The evidence for this is overwhelming. There were several shots that missed JFK, 2 of which struck Governor Connolly and 1 of which struck the chrome surround of the windshield. The shot in the back was an underpowered round, likely shot via a sabot, which was found years later on the county records building roof. 1 shot struck the road behind the limousine, 1 struck a manhole cover and buried itself in the grass, later retrieved by an unknown agent, and yet another hit a curbstone and injured James Take. Professional assassins do not miss their target 6 times, nor do they miss by such margins. The second operation was planned in one of 2 ways. Either it encouraged the implementation of the dummy attempt, as a means of enabling an actual assassination, by a separate individual, or it learned of the dummy attempt, and took the opportunity to use it as cover. The second operation was the gunman on the South Knoll. This person had one task: to kill the president. Of the 2 scenarios, the first seems the most likely. The whole elaborate scheme was to kill the president, and include a dummy attempt. It was a masterpiece of an operation because it blackmailed several different agencies into silence, lest they be deemed complicit. The third and final operation in play that day was the hastily assembled abort team, flown in by Tosh Plumlee. This was triggered by intelligence supplied by Eugene Dinkin, a cryptographer based in Europe, and Lee Oswald, acting on intelligence gathered after attempting to infiltrate the plot. It is worth noting that the documentary evidence concerning Dinkin, although obviously leaked a lot earlier, was amongst the evidence released by presidential mandate in 2017. It logically follows that the longer evidence is withheld, the more sensitive and relevant it is likely to be. This three-operation scenario forms an overall hypothesis supported by the evidence gathered for this presentation. Crucially, this overall scenario supports the hypothesis that the throat shot and headshot had to have been made by the same person, the only person in the plaza shooting to kill JFK. Let us now summarize. Parkland doctors identify a shallow throat wound, which has a slight left-to-right trajectory, anatomically. There is a bullet hole in the windshield, left of center. This is described by numerous witnesses, but in particular by two people uniquely qualified to determine that the hole originated from in front of the vehicle. Logic dictates that these 2 points are connected. On the horizontal plane, there is no other direction left of center anatomically that the bullet could have intersected with the neck, and it is illogical to suggest that the incoming bullet went anywhere else. There is a straight line between the 2 points. Use of digital software enables us to place JFK within the vehicle, at a particular location on Elm Street, which we can then use for our investigation, as the point the bullet struck. Elm Street road markings allow us to determine the orientation of the vehicle. This in turn allows calculation of the straight line we have established previously as bullet trajectory into the vehicle, because we have the incoming angle versus forward, or profile. Now we have an absolute bullet trajectory across Dealey Plaza, determined by 3 data points. From the point of bullet impact back to the muzzle of the rifle, we have mathematically calculated the point of origin, the location of the assassin. It is the center of the Terminal Annex parking lot, to the south of Dealey Plaza, the South Knoll. By doing this, we have also now determined a 4th necessary piece of data, that the bullet was traveling on a horizontal plane. The gunman, having failed to kill his target, now has probably one more chance to execute his mission, and his target. The head wound had a right temporal entry and right occipital parietal exit. It is essentially tangential, that means it is parallel with the center line of the skull. This means the president was shot from approximately the direction he was facing. The HSCA determined that direction to be 25 degrees left of profile. We have the point of impact, a well-known location on Elm Street. If we use the same method as we did for the throat shot to orient the vehicle, because we have the 3 necessary data points, we can once again mathematically calculate the trajectory of the bullet across Dealey Plaza. Once again, the point of origin is the center of the Terminal Annex parking lot. The throat shot was the key to pinpointing the location of the gunman. Plotting its trajectory gave us his position in Dealey Plaza. Using that location as the origin of the headshot tells us the path by which the bullet was able to enter the vehicle whilst avoiding other occupants. This confirmed Sherry's hypothesis. The calculated trajectory, plotted in either direction, matches the known facts for both shots. That both trajectories mutually support each other, along with the timeline of a strike which failed, followed very shortly afterwards by a fatal second shot, both frontal, proves conclusively that a single gunman, located on the boundary of the Terminal Annex parking lot, on the southern edge of Dealey Plaza, was responsible for killing John F. Kennedy. In the book The Inheritance by Christopher Fulton, the bullet that struck JFK is described as containing mercury. If true, those inside the limousine stood a chance of being contaminated with this highly toxic substance. Why is this relevant to this investigation? This photograph, taken by Robert Groden in the 1970s, shows what many believe to be a bullet scar on the north sidewalk of Elm Street. The full image, upper right, enables us to calculate a trajectory by using the horizontal edge of the paving slab as reference. An angle of 12 degrees is formed between the two. The official narrative, given by Larry Dunkel, who changed not only his name to Gary Mack, but also his allegiance, when he became director of the 6th Floor Museum, is contrived to say the least. This mark, says Dunkel, is the very top of a workman's cap, buried in the setting concrete, with only the tip touching the surface, and worn over time. The logic of that explanation is, quite frankly, risible. That in itself is a reason to dismiss it outright. However, because Dunkel was being paid to pervert the truth of the assassination by those who created the 6th Floor Museum, his being behind the official line is sufficient to consign him, and his explanation, to the trash can of history. This photograph was taken by Mrs. Robert Grodin in 2019. The pen in the center of the hole is Robert's approximate alignment of the scar, from memory. The inset picture superimposes the 12-degree angle over the large circular patch which has been applied to hide the scar. It is this large patch which necessitates the elaborate Dunkel cover story of the buried cap. Logic is a very powerful tool. If a cap were indeed buried while cement was being poured and was visible, it is illogical for that stone not to have been replaced immediately. The underpass in the plaza was a public works undertaking of massive proportions and a place of civic pride. The repair is far too small to correct the problem Dunkel described, yet unnecessarily large to patch a bullet graze. If a mercury-laden bullet fragment struck the pavement, however, causing the scar, then the large repair makes perfect sense, if the objective is to hide traces of mercury without the need to replace a whole paving slab. The red line towards the South Knoll is perfectly aligned with the bullet scar from the 1974 image, once again using the edge of the paving stone as reference. Note the proximity of the trajectory to the Grodin X as it crosses Elm Street. It seems perfectly logical to suggest that, if indeed there were a bullet scar, then it was made by a mercury-laden bullet fragment, and it originated from, and was fired by, a South Knoll assassin. It was then patched years later to remove the possibility of mercury contamination being discovered. This of course is speculation, and the repair has put paid to it ever being proven, if true. That is, unless documentation exists discussing the repair and the reason for it. Hopefully this exercise in logic has demonstrated that there is only one possible location for the successful assassin in Dealey Plaza, and that is the South Knoll. This video is dedicated to the memories of the late Sherry Feaster, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and as a demonstration of support for justice for Lee Oswald, a wronged and innocent man.